Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Shane Beamer, the South Carolina Gamecocks sound like they're not done quite yet in the transfer portal, as it sounds like they're going to make a serious run at former Penn State wide receiver Harrison Wallace III in the transfer portal, set to have him on campus at some point in the near future. This is a fun conversation to have because we've had this a lot over the last couple of weeks, and that is, hey, is South Carolina going to make a move for a wide receiver in the transfer portal? Now, I think Shane Beamer's made it very clear that he is not interested in participating for some of those bidding wars for some of the flashier names at the top of the wide receiver position in the transfer portal. South Carolina made a run at KC Concepcion. It would have made a lot of sense to add a guy like KC to this South Carolina offense, but at the end of the day, we knew what was the driving force in that transfer portal recruitment. That was how many zeros are on the check. And for every target that you saw emerge that, would be a good player to add to South Carolina was not going to come at it from a standpoint of, hey, we're just going to outbid the rest of the teams that want this kid. They've largely been methodical. They've let the process play out. I don't think it's a coincidence that South Carolina has done most of their work in the transfer portal towards the tail end of the cycle because they are waiting for guys that make sense for them at the right price. And Harrison Wallace, to me, looks to be that kind of guy. Now, as a Big Ten guy myself, I'm pretty familiar with Harrison Wallace. This one would make a lot of sense because you look at Harrison Wallace, this is just a polished, well-rounded wide receiver that's played a lot of football, that is produced at a high level, and a guy that the kind of wide receiver that maybe South Carolina is looking for. Where you look at where the wide receiver room is right now, look, I think Nick Harbor has every chance in the world to be that wide receiver one for South Carolina, but there's still some progression that needs to happen with Nick Harbor. He's still a little bit of a one-dimensional guy that's just really big, really fast, and wants to work vertically down the field. Now, I think in the ideal case for South Carolina, it's say Nick Harbor kind of polishes up and that light bulb comes on going into year 3, which I think is a real possibility that we see play out. You have your wide receiver one. And so now you're looking for another, polished veteran wide receiver two. That could be Harrison Wallace. And what stands out to me about Harrison Wallace is, one, this Penn State team liked him. 77 targets went to Harrison Wallace. The tight end position with Tyler Warren got a lot of attention from the national media for Penn State. And he was certainly the guy they wanted to run this offense through. But you look at Harrison Wallace, he was that second pass catcher option that what you love so much about him is he's a multi-dimensional wide receiver that can attack all 3 levels of the football field. He can create separation in some of those short intermediate route trees. He can work vertically down the field and use that big frame to go up and make plays. He also gives you some juice after the catch. And this is a guy that you can add to the wide receiver room and pretty much do anything that you want with Harrison Wallace. That's why it makes sense to me. Now, we're going to get a little bit more into Harrison Wallace. We're going to pull up the depth chart, talk about what this wide receiver room looks like and what it might look like with the addition of Harrison Wallace. Before we get into it, as always, to the South Carolina fans, one, would love to hear how you guys are feeling about this one. Because I know there's a lot of South Carolina fans that wanted to see South Carolina make an addition at the wide receiver spot. This one, to me, would make a lot of sense. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into Harrison Wallace. Now, a briefly overview on my opinion of Harrison Wallace. What you love most is them to do. And as much as that's kind of a boring conversation, I think it's an important one because you look at the landscape of wide receivers in the college football landscape, it's a lot of, I don't know if I'd use the term one-trick pony. That sounds like it's disrespectful, but it's a lot of wide receivers that, excel at one thing, but don't necessarily have a well-rounded game. Harrison Wall, he might not have that elite trait in terms of, hey, does he have elite size? Does he have elite vertical speed? No, he's probably not elite in any single category, but he's really damn solid in a lot of categories. He blocks on the perimeter quite well. That might be the wide receiver that South Carolina's missing because you start pulling up the depth chart and talking about, hey, where do our wide receivers like to work? We know what Nick Harbor is. Now, again, the ideal situation for Nick Harbor is puts it all together in 2025 and he's your wide receiver one, which I think there's a lot of confidence within that South Carolina program can happen. And I don't think it's a coincidence that South Carolina didn't really be all that aggressive for an elite wide receiver. That tells me as an outsider, they think Nick Harbor is going to be that guy in 2025. You have Jared Brown coming back, that transfer from Coastal Carolina, who's really good after the catch with the football in his hands, but how polished of a wide receiver is he actually is the question. Mazio Bennett on the inside, I think he's going to be really, really good as a slot wide receiver. Now, here's the interesting conversation is outside of those three guys, I think there's going to be a lot of reliance on some true freshman wide receivers, which is not really a bad thing. You know, you're hearing good things about Brian Rowe and Malik Clark as early enrollees for South Carolina. Y'all know how I feel about Donovan Murph coming in. He'll get in the summer. I think he's probably the best wide receiver that South Carolina signed. But do you want to have so much reliance, you might say, on true freshman wide receivers in 2025 with the quarterback Lenore Sellers, who I think is still developing? You know, to me, Lenore Sellers looking to take that next step in 2025. I would not mind to see South Carolina go out and add a wide receiver like Harrison Wallace, who's that, for lack of better term, steady Eddie wide receiver that can do a lot of things at a really high level. And so for me, this one makes a lot more sense than shelling out a ton of money for a guy like Casey Concepcion, because you might have your true wide receivers, your wide receiver one, Nick Harbor. To me, Harrison Wallace makes a lot of sense. We'll see what they decide to do. But again, I think South Carolina's process in the transfer portal and their, I would probably say, lack of aggression to add a wide receiver, I don't think that has to do with South Carolina just swinging and missing. I think it has a lot to do with, hey, we got a lot of confidence in guys like Nick Harbor, and guys like Mazio Bennett, and guys like Donovan Murph, Malik Clark, and Brian Rowe. That wide receiver position might be just a position that we feel pretty good with. We'll see how it plays out. To me, Harrison Wallace as that multidimensional, really solid wide receiver who has a lot of experience is probably something I should have added. It is experience. It might be the name to the game here. Because you look at Nick Harbor, he's probably at the power 4 level. He's probably the most experienced wide receiver you have. You know, Jared Brown has some experience coming from Coastal, but that's a big jump to the SECs going into year 2. Mazio Bennett's going to be a sophomore. Then you got a bunch of true freshmen. You have Vandrevius Jacobs, who I like a lot, but also a young kind of cat. Good football player in Harrison Wallace. With the experience that South Carolina is probably looking for, this one would make a lot of sense. And again, the process has been money for Shane Beamer. Hey, there was a lot of fans that were banging the table, and we were at times too, saying, hey, go get an elite wide receiver. Well, it's easy to say that. I think South Carolina wanted to take the approach of, hey, we're just going to wait and let some good football players kind of come to us. This would be the one that would make a lot of sense for South Carolina. We'll get out of here on that. We'll see how it works out for South Carolina. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and would love to hear from y'all in the comment section. Appreciate you guys. We'll talk to y'all later. Peace.